from SACMEQ to Ziba.
Working?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, sir. SACMEQ is the Southern and Eastern African Consortium for Monitoring Education Quality, and it is actually, it consists of a group of ministers of education from these countries who decided to work together to monitor the conditions of schooling in their education systems. SACMEQ was born around 1989 as a project at IIP, when one of the SACMEQ countries was actually interested in monitoring the quality of their education, which was Zimbabwe, and IIP assisted Zimbabwe to come up with this project, designed it, and when the project was successful in Zimbabwe, then the other countries joined because they were interested in monitoring the conditions of schooling. So SACMEQ has been two-tied. Our program is basically integrated research and training program, which is tailor-made to serve the interest of the SACMEQ countries in a way that we assess the conditions of schooling. We look at the whole system, the inputs, the process, and the outcome. At the same time, we train by learning and doing. We capacitate national research coordinators or research teams throughout the activities involved in carrying out these studies. As such, SACMEQ has not only built the data archive or reliable data for assessment, but has also built capacity in all these countries, whereby now SACMEQ activities at country level are running, and the coordinating center has a lesser job of just assuring the quality of the research and making sure that the methodology is kept up to date and is of high quality. SACMEQ data is available freely, and now you can download the data archive from the website, from the SACMEQ website. The tools that we use are also available online. Of course, the tests are not all available because, like in all assessments, we track changes over time. So some of the items are not available online because we want to keep them in order to use them for linking purposes so that you can be able to compare the trends over time and make sure that countries get useful information about whether they are improving or not improving over time. When it comes to indicators, SACMEQ is actually well placed in most of the indicators that you'll be looking at post-2015, more especially those indicators that are going to be collected through school-based surveys. Because we have built capacity, we have the tools and the instruments, and most of the areas we have been covering, it will be a matter of expanding and making sure that the measurement part is attended to, and we still maintain the high quality standards and instruments and tools, and we capacitate the countries to be able to take the work forward. The challenge that is foreseen in attending to delivering the information that is required post-2015 will be that countries will definitely need support, financial support, because currently they are supporting themselves in order to collect the data or implement the data collection activities at country level, and expanding in order to take aboard international commitments might require some external support. But otherwise, in terms of methodology, my belief is that looking at the type of indicators that are required, as long as we agree on the definition and the skills that are required, SACMEQ would be in a position to amend and expand the current tools in order to provide those. We will also love as SACMEQ to see our tools and instruments maintained the way they are in the SACMEQ countries, because they are not only survey instruments, but they are also made to deliver a certain service to the countries. In terms of political will, we have the political will. SACMEQ is an assessment program that is driven by the ministers, and they have commitment, and in their just ended assembly, they have committed to expanding the assessments to cover additional levels and also additional areas, because we actually designed the SACMEQ assessments around the policy concern and the interest of the different ministries. We have also tried to expand in terms of benchmarking with other assessments like PASEC, and we have for some time now been having some items from other programs, and we also try to experiment and see whether some of the methodologies and procedures from other programs can work for us, which means in a way we are expanding the capacity building and the skills that we impart in the different countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tuziba. So we have completed the round of 7 minutes for each of the speakers, where they have laid out for us a description of their particular assessment, but also some points and some ideas on the questions that we are posing. We're going to move into a question, comment, answer session, and I will open that to the floor. And I would ask you if you can direct your question specifically to 1 or 2 of the speakers, so that we know who will respond. So as you think of those questions, I will start out with one question, and then we'll start with the audience. So there is this notion, this idea, this push for a global indicator on learning. And from hearing your 7 minutes, it seems to me, first, the fact that we have regional assessments suggests a need for contextual aspects of that indicator. Even the fact that PISA has created the PISA for development and that PIRLS has a pre-PIRLS also suggests the fact that perhaps the scaling questions between developed nations and developing nations pose a challenge for a global indicator. I'd like to hear very briefly your views on that. Do you think that there might be adverse effects of setting a global indicator for learning, or how would you go about that? Obviously, each of your assessments has done something about it, as I just said, but I'd like to hear your views as experts and with experience in implementation of these large assessments. If perhaps a couple of you can take a few minutes to respond on that, and then we'll start with the questions from the audience. Yes, please, go ahead, Moritz.
Thank you so much. Yes, it seems a little bit paradoxical, isn't it, that well, we've got 3 regional assessments here, and well, obviously IEA, which is working in many countries, and then we would weigh in on the global indicator issue, but actually we don't think it is. And around 1 year ago, we actually met here in a meeting sponsored by the Global Partnership for Education under the coordination of Luis, I don't know, yeah, Luis is over there, in which we're actually thinking whether we can methodologically link the PASEC, the SACMEQ, and the YES studies, also involving IEA. And we think that's pretty interesting, because as said, what we are doing is not defining some kind of external standard that we're then imposing on the countries, as some other study might do, but we're actually mapping the curricula of the countries, creating some kind of synthesis of what all those curricula say, of the learning objectives, and then actually hold up some kind of mirror to the countries and say, okay, this is what you said you would educate your children to, because we're talking mainly about children, primary school children, and this is actually what you achieve. It might exceed it might be a little bit lower, etc. So it's some kind of bottom-up work from the regions, looking at the curricula, and then seeing whether we can come to some kind of common denominator of what, according to the government, children should learn in all countries. In that respect, I don't see any kind of adverse effect, because our indicator is the curriculum. I don't think that the curriculum as such has got any adverse effects, but would be, interested in hearing any views to the contrary from the audience as well.
Yeah, I
Dirk.
agree with.
Yeah, just briefly, I completely agree to that, actually. I think setting indicators is something that also encourages countries to think about their educational system, to review what they have. And actually, when I think back, what we got as feedback also from countries is that some countries, when they saw what other countries are doing, they were revisiting also their curriculum, and sometimes they realized that their aims in the curriculum are set at a very low standard. And of course, what can you expect from the children if what you want to achieve is pretty low, actually? So also in these terms, I think setting the indicators and enforcing countries to mirror and to review their systems is very important. And I think what Miguel yesterday said is we don't only need to know where you are, but also how to improve. And I think this is where these assessments come into place, that you look at the curriculum, what they're aiming at, what is actually being practiced in schools, and then finally look what is the outcome. And I think in this sense, global indicators and focusing on international comparisons plays a major role in improving educational systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Dirk. Let's see if Andreas wants to weigh in on this one. I see your hand up, so Andreas, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I agree with that perspective. I think we need to really work on multi-layered assessment systems that extend from the classroom to the school, to the region, to the national level, to the global level, and try to integrate those things as best as possible rather than pitching them one against the other. And in fact, with the PISA assessment, we have done a lot of work in this area, linking national assessments with PISA so that you can actually see, this is important to us as a nation or to us as a region. How does it relate to what is important to other countries, other regions around the world? And I think that helped us also to triangulate, Some countries may put greater emphasis on algebra, others may put greater emphasis on statistics or geometry, and by seeing yourself in the mirror of what other countries aspire to, you actually get a lot of added value from the global perspective, and the same from the school perspective. So really developing a culture of assessment that is not just summative at one level, but that extends from classroom up to the global level is really, I think, what is now technically possible.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andreas. Let's go to the questions from the floor, unless any other panels. Let's go to the questions on the floor. And what I'll do is collect 3 questions, then we'll have the panel response, and then we'll go back to the questions. So you were first.
Okay. I'll address my question to Dirk and Andreas, but primarily because those are the only 2 assessments I know anything about. I think the question probably applies to everyone. It's a 2-part question. The first is how the international community can make more use of disparities in results between the assessments. There are, for instance, in the case of TIMSS and PISA mathematics, there are a great many similarities, but there are important differences, and not just in the case of isolated countries like Norway and Russia. The relative placement of the higher achieving countries in Europe versus developed East Asia are very different. The relationship between country and within country variation in student performance is very different. So part A of the question is, how can we better make use of these variations in results? The second part is what the organizations running these assessments can do to allow the international community to make use of these variations with more confidence. So for instance, in the case of PISA and TIMSS, to my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, there are no cases where the competing assessments have been administered to randomly equivalent samples. So we don't know the extent to which differences are attributable, say, to the assessment content versus sampling. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, there have been very few efforts to embed items from one of the assessments in the other. So I'm curious about whether it's practical to take steps to allow people to make use of these variations and results with more confidence.
Thank you very much. Let's go to a second question. Somebody here had a question. Please go ahead.
Yes, yesterday I think we talked a little bit about the need to look at how assessment can actually be used to improve learning. And at least a couple of the panelists talked about how assessment in the region, I think Jelek and maybe Pasek, about how these assessments have actually been used by countries to change policy or look at improvements. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit more specifically about what that looks like. What sort of processes have been used, and do you have any evidence that that has actually taken place, where there's been policy change, that there have been improvements in learning outcomes?
Thank you very much. And one last question, Luis in the back, and then we'll go to another round in a minute.
Actually, this is not so much a question as a very quick comment, and that is that I think on this debate or discussion around a global indicator, we will make a lot more progress if we use much more precise language. And, you know, are we talking about an indicator? Are we talking about a metric? Are we talking about benchmarks on a metric? If I, you know, so my comment or my suggestion as we move forward with these debates is that we start with very precise definitions of the terms that we're talking about, because otherwise it's very confusing.
Thank you, Luis. Let's take this two questions and a comment and have the panel respond. Let's start with the one of disparities that was set out. Perhaps, Andreas, you want to start, since that was directed to you and to Dirk?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. In fact, I think it's good that we have those disparities. If all the assessments would tell you the same story, you would just need one of them. And in fact, if you look at this closely, there has been a researcher, Margaret Wu, has actually written a great paper linking TIMSS and the PISA study and showing what's the impact of the different nature of the test, what's the impact of a difference in the target population. And in fact, I mean, further research in that is necessary. On the question from Dan also, we have actually some countries that have embedded TIMSS IDEN in PISA assessments and probably vice versa. So actually there's a great deal that we know about why countries perform differently. The target population is one explanatory factor. You know, some countries tend to do better in young populations, and students do less well when they get older. You know, that's one explanation that shows why, you know, you might do better on TIMSS than on PISA. In other countries, it's very much the nature of the test. The Russian Federation comes out really very good on TIMSS, doesn't do so well on PISA. You can actually figure that out when you look at the type of task, no? The kind of tasks requiring more sort of responses to open-ended tasks, requiring students to demonstrate critical thinking, reflection, that are very strong on PISA, is where Russian students don't tend to do so well. So there is some explanation actually available. On the question of, you know, impact on learning, I think that's a very important one. The test of truth for any assessment is it going to make a difference in the classroom? Let me just give you two examples. My own country, Germany, is a good one. You know, it went through what is called the PISA shock in the year 2000. The country was deeply unhappy with its outcome, not only in terms of quality, but also in terms of equity. So actually policymakers and practitioners really began to work on this, trying to find better ways to serve students with an immigrant background, from disadvantaged social background. And 10 years later, you can actually see marked improvements on PISA, not only in quality, but also in equity. You take the country of Japan, you know, in 2000 they did already do well, but they saw actually our students are not doing well on students requiring them to construct knowledge. They were very good on reproducing knowledge, but not good on constructing knowledge. So they actually made a lot of changes to curricula, to instructional policies and practices, and actually again, 10 years later, you do see that students have become, relatively speaking, better on those kinds of tasks. So there's actually, we have actually done some very systematic studies to look at the impact that these assessments had on policy and practice, and it's actually quite encouraging that those things make actually a difference.
Thank you. Dirk, you want to complement that?
Sure. Well, in terms of the first question, I agree to what Andrea said. I mean, there is quite a number of research out there. And additionally, I mean, the PISA data, as well as all the IA data, is available to download and to analyze. And I can strongly encourage everyone to make use. And in the list of publications that I've shown, there is also some publications that make use of both PISA and TIMSS and look at them, how they are complementary and what our differences in results could mean. So I think there's quite a bit. regarding the question of policy changes, I had in my presentation some changes, some impact that are there, and there is some literature there. There are some reviews done also by the World Bank on what are the impacts. And the impacts and changes are quite diverse. It really depends on the country where they see that changes are needed and are most useful. So as I said, there are some countries where significant curriculum changes were done because they saw that they were not good in certain requirements, or they saw that there was a lack in a certain area, and a certain area was absolutely not covered in their curriculum, so they implemented it. There were some countries that had some trainings for teachers because they saw that although the goals were set in the curriculum, it didn't make it actually to the implementation phase. And then there are also some countries where the assessment had some also direct impacts. One example is Chinese Taipei, which actually achieved very high. But they saw that compared to the other high-scoring Asian countries, they had a long tail with lower-performing students. Well, so what they did, they had a new program set up where they used a lot of unemployed teachers, and each individual student of the lower-performing bottom of that got a private mentor that helped them speeding up. So I think there is a lot of policy changes that are taking place on all different levels, from curriculum down to the implementation, which really depends on where the countries see that they want to improve and where they see that there's a gap or a lack and that there is room for improvement. So I think it's quite diverse, but it's used tremendously around the world.
Thank you, Dirk. Jacques, you have something to say about this point, perhaps, of the policy and impact?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I think I fully agree with Luis when he says that we should be very precise in our terms, and I think there are two different issues. There is the issue of the global indicator, which is definitely something important, and we might go to this type of indicator, and the fact of having assessment and the use of the assessment to improve the policies. I think the two issues are not exclusive one to each other, but not exactly the same point. And on the partnership, it's clear that all the project or all the initiative to conduct assessment at the international or national level should work more together to improve themselves and to bring a better service. And not only for our project. I think there are some other projects like the service delivery indicator of the World Bank. I mean, they are working on similar issues, on providing information to improve the national policies. I think one of the main points is how the results of the assessment can be transformed in policies, in changes in policies, reforms. I give you one example. For instance, when we see that the negative effect of the repetition, if we just abolish the repetition, I mean, means that we don't have the good solution to a real problem, meaning that we need to take very good care of the repetition, and especially the low level of the pupils of the early grades, the first, second, third grade, which have high level of repetition and start for the exclusion, which means that it's costing money to the system just for no result or very few results. I think we should put a strong emphasis on the national capacity to better utilize the results of the evaluation, be better involved in all the process of the assessment, and engage in a policy dialogue, including not only the official from the minister. Yesterday it was said that education is something too important to be given to the educationalists. I fully agree with that, and I think we should embark civil societies, but also national parliament. Very few people speak about the role of the national parliament. They vote the budget, and it is very important. And most of the time, they are totally put aside of all this discussion and process. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Tuziba, you want to add something?
Yes, I wanted to add something. In SACMEQ countries, the impact or the evidence for impact is there. since we started our SACMEQ assessments, we have realized some policy changes in a number of SACMEQ countries, even teacher training programs, because the way the results are done is such that we actually show the policy recommendations and where the gaps exist. So as a result, countries like Seychelles have had to review their streaming policies. Countries like Botswana, Namibia had to relook at their teaching and learning materials, for example, textbooks, whether they are really congruent with the curricula and the syllabi. So as we have also seen, like following the result of the SACMEQ 3 studies, we have seen a big education debate in the Republic of South Africa, which was informed by the SACMEQ 3 results. And as such, that's why countries, SACMEQ countries, continue to commit in doing SACMEQ studies.
Thank you. Let's take a next round of questions. So we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 for this round.
I am Egli Zafirakou from the Global Partnership for Education. We can see clearly today that we are in a movement of international assessment. We have the movement of international assessment. But especially for the low-income countries, we know that there is a huge emergency. According to Brookings, around 100 million children, 180 million children cannot read. And so my question is related how from the movement of assessment we can arrive to the movement of learning, especially for the poorest children, the children on low-income countries. So this is a question for this international assessment, and I would like also to add in my question one notice how you consider in the expansion of these international assessment systems the reality in low-income countries, because of course we understand that if you are informing Japan or Germany how to improve the system, it's different than if you are informing a country where they are just building the education system. So how you are taking in consideration this huge learning emergency that we have to act now, and also the reality of the systems, of education systems in the low-income countries where the Global Partnership for Education is working.
Thank you very much. Second question.
Perhaps building on that, quite a practical question in terms of you representing the major international and regional assessments internationally. What practical steps are you taking to move us over the next 2 years towards a situation where we may have an international goal that is centred on learning? And then a comment to say, I encourage and applaud the collaboration between PASEC and SACMEQ. Moritz, you mentioned the meeting you had a year ago, so perhaps where's that conversation got to? PISA didn't seem to be part of that discussion a year ago. Is there a reason for that? And what are the practical steps over the next 2 years?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm Peter Materu from the Africa Region Education Team. I listened very carefully to Moritz, Jacques, and Toziba, who are people on the ground implementing assessment systems. And I was impressed by what they were saying, that there is strong ownership, there is a customization to the local context, etc. And so this is really very encouraging to see that there is experience already out there. And when you asked the question at the beginning, Alberto, the response I heard from the three was that, yes, we can support a global effort to build a global indicator. But the question I have is, what do they want, the three of them? What kind of assistance from the global level that would help to make what they're doing better, that would help to better link what they're doing to learning improvement in the countries? Because if we're going to have a global indicator, it has to be a value added to what is already being done by this regional and country efforts. So some ideas from them. What is that one or two things that could be a value added from a global effort, or a global indicator plus? Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And the last question of this round.
Thank you. I'm Pauline Rose from the Education for All Global Monitoring Report. We have used all of your surveys quite extensively, including in the upcoming report on teaching and learning. And one of the things we have tried to do, and I'm sure with sort of mixed success, is sort of anchor across the different surveys to see how many children aren't learning the basics. And as some of you will have seen, our sort of analysis suggests that it's at least 250 million children not learning the basics. Of course, there are flaws with this because not all countries are covered by these surveys, that the anchoring is obviously sort of, there's more work that could be done to do that more effectively. But I guess what it shows is that there is a huge crisis that we were discussing yesterday, and that's the reason why we need a global learning goal. So I think we've got to remember why we need the global learning goal, and then what we can do about it. And I feel that we go round in circles a bit because we're sort of going round, can we have a measure that would be global, sort of building on Lewis's point, moving beyond just talking about the goal, but are we trying to get a measure that could be globally applicable? If so, what would it look like? Or should we do it? Is this going to be dangerous? And what I would like to ask, quite practically, if you, as the experts, in the next 3 months, perhaps GPE could convene you again, come up with some options as to what you could measure across your different surveys that would allow us to have an indicator that would be global. What aspects of learning could we include within that? And of course, that would help us to know what we wouldn't be able to include, what might need to be done more at a national level, which of course is also an important part of it. And not just in terms of what we're measuring in terms of learning, but also in terms of the background of the students, because one of the important aspects of this global learning goal is making sure that no one is left behind. So are there ways to ensure the comparability of SACMEQ status, for example, across the different surveys? So can we do that in the next 3 months, that you would provide us as the education community with options that we could then debate and be consulted on? Thank you.
Thank you. So we have 4 questions on the ground. So Moritz, you wanna start? And I'm turning also to seeing Andreas. I'm sure he has his hand up as well. So let's get started.
Yes. All right. Maybe first things first, to the lady over there. One important thing I think to realize with UNESCO is that for us, education can be something that contributes to economic growth. Which might be a little bit the Worldbank, Inter-American Development Bank paradigm, but in the first place, it's human rights. Yeah, I mean, if it helps to support economic growth, that's great, but it's something that we believe everybody has a right to, and that makes it the case that, and that's a little bit going back to a previous question, that in terms of policy changes, there can be negative changes and positive changes, right? So if we've got some kind of assessment on mathematics and language and that kind of stuff, then we've got the question of whether history and arts and sports is not important, right? And that might be a collateral effect that would happen if we would implement our studies without any consideration. You were talking about the poorest persons. Yes, in Latin America the context is different than in Japan or Germany. Many teachers have got a second job or a third job. We call the Latin American countries middle-income countries, which means that the problematic is not that grave as it is in some parts of South Asia or Africa, although some countries like Bolivia, Guatemala and Nicaragua are struggling with the real difficult situation. So that means that the associated factors questionnaires that we design are probably different from the one that are designed in Germany and Japan. When a teacher's got 2 or 3 jobs, it is really difficult for this person to deliver quality education once she or he comes to the classroom. In our case, it's mostly she, because as we know, there's this issue of feminization of primary education, which means that in our region, and I think globally, around 80% of primary education teachers are women. So how do we ensure that these persons benefit? It's a difficult question. We are obviously trying to make sure it benefits, and I think for the 3rd study the results will be available from 2014, and we are working with many partners now on how we can make sure that these findings are translated into key messages that will then have maximum impact. But that's actually what we're working on now, and As a matter of fact, also in response to the gentleman over there, we actually need quite a lot of help from UNICEF, if possible, from the World Bank, etc., to be able to do that basic work. Because in Santiago, we're working with a very small team. We've got a core team of 3 persons. I think in the data processing center, there's more than 100. Persons working, so we're working under difficult circumstances with a small team. The countries are paying a very small annual contribution, as you can see in the information sheet, $10,000. That's a fraction of what they're paying for PISA. Also because the countries don't have a lot of money, but yeah, I mean there's some challenges there. In response to the question from the gentleman over there, and also of my colleague Pauline Rose from UNESCO in Paris. It's difficult to answer that because as YESE we were always committed to work together with IEA and PASEC and SACMEQ in pulling ourselves together and working on this. That was at the time under the coordination of Luis. After that there was a change in leadership in SACMEQ. There was not an official leadership in PASEC. The person in GP who we worked with left as well, but as YESE and as IEA, I've been talking to Hans Wagemark about this, we remain firmly committed to trying to link up horizontally. So if there's any initiative on a global partnership of education or any other global institution, any kind of initiative to convene us newly, I think it would be very good because we need to coordinate among ourselves so that we don't duplicate efforts. All 4 of us are looking at primary education mainly. PISA is looking at secondary education, so there's a bit of a difference there. I don't think there's any need for competition. And just to close on the question of Pauline Rose, how can we come to a global indicator? I think that Miguel Jekeli of Mexico said something important yesterday, that when we're looking at the LMTF 7 dimensions, this is hugely ambitious. It's pretty much impossible to do anything practical with it anytime soon, but can we prioritize? Can we say that literacy and numeracy are maybe some of the most important things? And can we maybe instruct some kind of indicator around that? And can we maybe use the scales that we are already operating, can we operationalize them into an indicator? That's what I would propose. Let's try to look at literacy and numeracy. Let's look at some kind of point scales, and let's try to establish some kind of standards. I think that Ray Adams said some really interesting stuff around that. Let's translate the indicator into metrics. And I think that literacy and numeracy should be highest on the list. Combine that with associated factors, because what's an input and what's an outcome sometimes varies, right? Because literacy is an outcome of learning, but it's also an input into learning. Because if you're not literate, you can't read your school text kind of thing. So some conceptual work to be done there, but I would definitely say literacy, numeracy, and maybe some varying annual modules like SACMEQ had got this HIV/AIDS module to their last study, and maybe we can do some regional stuff around that as well.
Thank you, Moritz. Let's see if any other folks from the panel have something to say. Dirk is here. I see a hand, and then we'll come to Washington. So Dirk, then we'll go to Andreas, and then back in Washington.
Yeah, thank you. I completely agree to what's been said there. Although for the indicators, I think we need some more discussions, actually. On top of that, I would especially answer to the question, what's in it for low-income countries? And my opinion on that is, especially when resources are limited, you should be very carefully monitoring where you put your resources into. So I think especially for low-income countries, these international assessments or assessments in general play a major role to review where's the biggest need and where and how to invest the limited resources that you have most efficiently. So I think especially for these countries, it's important to monitor better what they have. And in a country like Germany, that's financially probably very good or whatever, there's definitely more opportunities, but if you have a limited budget, you should clearly monitor where to put the money into. And I think for these kind of tasks, the information given by all of these assessments are very important. It's not only, or it's not at all these ranking between countries, it's more what can we do and what are the differences also within the country, and how can we ensure that the educational system work good, efficiently, and how do we achieve equity in the countries. And I think for this, that's the major emphasis at where we can have an impact.
Andreas?
Yeah, I very much agree with that line as well. But I sort of want to stress our priority with PISA is actually not to develop some global indicator. Our priority really is to develop global metrics that allow countries to learn from each other, learn at the policy level and the practical level. It's really to provide countries with the tools to see what the alternatives are to what they're currently doing. I'm actually not at all worried about having multiple or even duplication in assessments. What worries me a lot more is that we have a lot of duplication in policies. Countries are repeating mistakes that other countries have been made, and these kinds of assessments allow you to look outwards, to look what your neighbor is doing, to learn from them, to collaborate. And this is actually what we have been seeing across the world. And that's exactly the kind of development that we want to foster. If the result at some point is a global indicator, fine, but surely that's not sort of our priority, our starting point. On the question, what are we practically doing to actually work towards this goal? Well, PISA as it stands covers some 70 plus countries, highly developed ones, emerging economies, poorly developed countries. That has been working quite well. And actually, when you look at those data, you see that actually the world is no longer divided into rich and well-educated and poor and badly educated ones. In fact, there are a lot of surprises in this. But it's also become clear to us that expanding beyond these 75 countries is actually very, very hard. What are we doing very practically to do that? There are three challenges that we are currently working to overcome with our PISA for Development program. The first is we need to adapt and customize our contextual instruments. Having a single contextual questionnaire that we administer to students in schools and so on simply doesn't give meaningful results in national context. So we're working with each country actually to find tailors, to have something that we call mass customization, to have enough standardization to allow for comparisons, but enough adaptation to actually allow countries to make those things, instruments, meaningful. That's one priority. The second priority, this is actually the one that worries me most, is in many of those countries, there's a large group of young people no longer in school at all. And actually we're developing instruments to assess the skills of those young people. Because if we omit them from assessments, this is going to have perverse effects. Because actually as an education system, the more people you admit, the better you look in those kinds of assessments. So we have developed methodologies through our PIAC assessment. To do that, we are now extending that to this PISA for Development, to find ways, find methodologies to reach out to children not in school. That was the second priority. And the third priority is to extend the reach of our measurement instruments. In fact, it's possible to test people with very low abilities. But actually what you want to tell policymakers and practitioners, what is it exactly that those people who do not, for example, reach baseline, as Pauline said, you can say there are 250 million not reaching the basics. But what is it exactly that those kids are struggling with? Now, is it the building blocks of literacy? Is it the elementary foundations of numeracy? So building measurement tools to capture that variability is our third priority. If we manage to address those three priorities, we should be able to actually pretty much universalize assessments like PISA.
Thank you, Andreas. So I've already been given a sign saying time up, so I'm going to give the last word to Jacques and to Siva in case they have some closing words. And we will have then a coffee break, so if there's a question that you have burning, you can access the panelists in the coffee break. Jacques.
Thank you, Alberto. First of all, I think regarding the global indicator, I think we might start with what on which we all agree, which is numeracy and literacy. And there is a proposal from the Learning Metrics Task Force to break down with grade 3 and grade 6. I think so. I think this might be a first first step for this. Secondly, I think it is fairly important that this type of debate, well, firstly, we keep having it, but also it goes at the country level. And the GP has set up a local education group in each country, and I think this issue of assessing should be part of the debates at the national level within the local education group. So, and I think the agencies, whether it is the World Bank, the UNESCO, or other bilateral agencies, should support that we have this type of debate at the national level also.
Thank you. Let me thank all of you for your contributions, but I think I agree with my colleagues to look at the global indicator. Basically, my take is that let's start by appreciating what we have and appreciating where the gaps are. And then we can build on what we have to make what we need. But otherwise, I think a lot of work is happening. A lot of methods and matrices are there. So since a lot of ground have been covered, we can compile and see where the gaps are, and also take aboard the countries in order to have political commitment. Because from our experience as SACMEQ, when you don't have political commitment, it's as good as not starting, because nothing will happen.
Well, I want to thank, first of all, our panelists, Andreas from the VC, Dirk, Moritz, Jacques, and Toshiba for their very thoughtful contributions, all of you for your questions. Again, the panelists will be available during the coffee break if there's a burning question that you had and you didn't have an option to put it forward. Thank you, everyone, and I guess we'll go for coffee break and then convene again at 11 in the morning here in this room, right? Thank you.